So tonight we're having a Bible study in 1 John chapter 2, as we do each Thursday evening. Tonight we're in 1 John chapter 2, and we're going to begin our reading and consideration down in verse 7. What we find here is that John, the beloved apostle, that John tells us three things, and he tells us those things lovingly and repeatedly in what we have illustrated with a spiral outline. The reality for Christians to know and understand and confess that Jesus came in the flesh, that he was, that he is the Son of God, Emmanuel, God with us, fully man, fully God, God in the flesh. We're to confess that fact as the scriptures reveal, that we need to be faithful. He will speak more about the commandments almost than anybody but Moses, John will, of keeping the instructions that God has provided for us for our benefit. And tonight we get to the third main theme for the first time in earnest, the idea of love of brethren, that this is the way of God, that this is the way of Christ. And so we've had these 3 points as the primary things, but tonight concentrating on love, as I say, for the first time, that John will say it's an old commandment, but it's also a new commandment. So it's the old new commandment. It's one of the central commandments, one of the central things that we, in our following of Christ, are to set our minds toward and make sure that we spend a great deal of time and energy and emphasis on. So tonight, love the old new commandment. Let's take a reading there from verses 7 to 11. We understand that he had just said in the paragraph above and how we were saved from our life of sin, that if we say we've come to know him and don't keep the commandments, his commandments, we're a liar, and the truth isn't in us, verse 4, but verse 5, if we keep his word, the love of God has in us been truly perfected. So he's going to talk about the love of God in us. Well, if we have the love of God in us, the love of God is such that God so loved the world, that in Romans 5, that's John 3, in Romans 5, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. This is God's love. That God is love, John will tell us. This is an immutable characteristic of God, and it's one that his children, in conformity with him, should fully follow. And so, verse 7, our reading beginning tonight. Beloved, I'm not writing a new commandment to you, but an old commandment, which you have had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you have heard. On the other hand, I am writing a new commandment to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. The one who says he's in the light and yet hates his brother is in darkness until now. The one who loves his brother abides in the light, and there is no cause for stumbling in him. But the one who hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness and does not know where he's going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. If you don't love your brother, you are in spiritual darkness and you are in spiritual blindness, no matter how enlightened your philosophy tells you that you are. And remember, that is John fights the Gnostics. And the 3 main points, as we mentioned in John, are points that counter Gnosticism on every turn. They couldn't conceive in their philosophies of how one could be truly God and truly man at the same time. And so every explanation that's not of the scriptures of the nature of Christ gets the nature of Christ wrong, either making too much of his humanity and making light of his deity, or making too much, if it's possible, and I suppose it is in the nature of Christ, making too much of an explanation of the deity without recognizing the true, full humanity. And so that's a Gnostic problem. The idea that by this knowledge of who Christ was and how the world works and how angelology and all these other things fit together, by this you're enlightened and can go to higher spiritual levels, that this is the true calling of Christianity rather than these practical things of, well, doing what God says, keeping his commandments. As a matter of fact, not only are they so much more important than keeping the commandments, they're the required part, and the commandment part's optional. No, John says you got to keep the commandments. And with this, well, as Paul said, and is proven true every day, 1 Corinthians 8, knowledge puffs up. Knowledge makes arrogant. These people who spent their time in these fancy philosophers, they looked down on their poor, regular, normal brethren who weren't so enlightened, who didn't know all these special and fancy things, had to work for a living, or were actually just, concerned with the plain reading of the text and not what all these philosophical conundrums dreamt up. And so they looked down on folks. They were arrogant. They didn't love their brother. So these three things are the products, both the cause, and the product of Gnosticism. This pagan heresies, pagan ideas come to the church and taking root. John is here to root them out. And so tonight, turning our attention full bore for the first time to love your brother. And we'll find out first, it's an old and a new commandment. So verse 7, beloved, I'm not writing a new commandment, but an old one. Well, what's older in the book of God than love your brother? God creating the world and God saying, don't eat of that tree. I suppose those are older things. A man and woman being joined in marriage, because it's by that process we get brothers, right? That would be older, but not much else. What's our second big story of failing and conflict in the scripture? Brother killing brother. And that was wrong from day 3 or day 4 or whatever the day count was when Cain slew his brother. So it's an old commandment to love your brother, to look after your brother. John says this is not new. You've always known this. We have known it from Genesis 4 onward. We think about this from the book of Deuteronomy, that the secret things belong to God. That's where these pagan philosophers were, and in pagan influenced Christians were going, all these supposedly secret things, that these things were the way of truth, these things were the way of enlightenment, these things were the path to salvation. Deuteronomy says, no, the secret things belong to God, but what's revealed belong to us and our sons, that we may observe them. Well, what was it regarding us and our sons that we should observe? Leviticus 19. What will become to the Jews and their formulation of the second most important commandment by the time of Jesus, something which Jesus doesn't dispute, but Jesus affirms. Leviticus 19:8, this, do not take your own vengeance, do not bear a grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Love your neighbor as yourself. The Jews rightly took on the importance of that instruction. There's so many things in the New Testament where it wasn't knowing the instruction that got the folks in trouble. It was the not following the instructions that got the people in trouble. For instance, all right, there we are. Camera's back. We think about the occasion that brought up the instruction regarding the Good Samaritan. The Jewish lawyer knew he should love his neighbor as himself, but he knew he wasn't doing it. And so when Jesus said, well, yeah, just do that. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, which is also the summation of that Matthew 22 passage that's on the screen. Jesus just told the man, well, just do that. And then he sought to justify himself. Why? Because he knew he didn't do it. So it was an old commandment. It was a well-known commandment. It was almost a proverbial commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. But then John goes on to say, hold on, there's more. John goes on to say in verse 8, on the other hand, what other hand? This is the oldest commandment there is just about. But on the other hand, I'm writing a new commandment to you, which is true in him and in you. So this is God's and yours both. This should be the truth in you as you're faithful. It's the truth in God as He's done it. It's true in Him and true in you because darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. I am writing to you a new commandment about love. And so there's a new commandment here. This is like Jesus in the Gospels, John 13 and 34, where we find there's a newness to this commandment. John 13:34, the new commandment. Jesus said, John 13:34, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. They were already to love one another as a neighbor. But now in the brotherhood, they're to love one another as Christ. Love as Christ. This is the fullness of the commandment. And this bit is new. You know, it's already a pretty full command to love your neighbor as yourself. I don't know of anybody I like more than me. Of course, at other times, I don't know anybody I dislike more than me either. But I usually do what I like. My wife will tell you, yeah, he does what he likes. But I often do what I like, and especially I do what I love. I do things that please me. I do things that suit me. And I don't even have to think about it because I just like doing it. It's me. What's not to like? I'm very lovable, at least to me. But I'm to think of my neighbor as myself. But Jesus said, I'm going to go farther than that. I'm going to say, love your brother as I love you. And so love of self is a pretty high standard, but love as Christ is even higher. And that's why it's new. And this will be shocking when you put it into practice. And so Jesus was able to say in John 13:35, the next verse. And I see we have a mistype on the screen. It should be 34:35. 35, by this all men will know that you're my disciples, that you love one another. This should be the defining token of a proof of a Christian relationship, of proof of faith in Christ, that you love one another like Christ. This is walking in true light. This is the light and will and way of Christ. As it says, it is true in Him and in you. If it's truly, it is. It's true in us when it's really there. It's true in Him all the time. It's already been proven. And this is what's driving away darkness. The darkness is passing away because the true light, the light of Christ that we are to have in us, is in the world. And we should be spreading that light. John 8 in verse 12 about Jesus' light. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And even further, maybe in John 3, this is judgment, that the light came to the world, and men loved darkness more rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be manifest, as having been wrought in God. Deeds of light are from God. They're worked, or wrought, the old word. They are worked in God. They are worked for others to the glory of God. Luther one time said about love of neighbor and love of God, he said, God doesn't need your love, but your neighbor does. Yes, God wants us to love Him. I'm saying love God. But God's existence, God's very life, God's comfort, God's peace of mind, God's needs are not met in our love. He wants relationship with us because we're His children. But my neighbor, they really do need my love and service and action. Sometimes it is life-saving. Sometimes it's life-changing, even when it's not life-saving. Sometimes it is day-brightening. It is a thing that is absolutely necessary. And it is the light of God to take it to folks. And so here is the new commandment. to love not just as yourself, but to love as Christ. And here come these guys who have these philosophies, these Gnostic influence things that tell them that's optional, that downplay this, that cause people to mistreat one another. It is no improvement on Christianity if your behavior gets worse. You haven't improved anything of your teaching if the fruit of it is bad. So these guys have bad fruit. They have hatred. They have darkness. And what we find is that light, in verse 9, light and love go together, and hate and darkness go together. Verse 9, the one who says he's in the light and yet hates his brother is in darkness until now. Now again, especially with philosophic diversions and philosophic heresies that claim to offer enlightenment. Right? That's what they claim. Enlightenment. You're claiming to offer enlightenment, but John says, no, buddy. You have stepped off into the dark alley. You have stepped into the dark, and your hatred of your brother shows it. We already had back in verse 1, chapter 1, where John brought this up first time, not in the main and not as the big point, but as a point. Chapter 1, verse 7, if we walk in the light as he himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. Fellowship. It's hard to have fellowship when you have hatred, right? Because fellowship is joint participation. Fellowship is communion. Fellowship is commonality. Fellowship is sharing. Fellowship is doing together. You don't do that with people you hate. Not for any longer you can stand it or hide it. No. The commandment is instead that you love one another. So if you hate your brother, you're in darkness until now, like right this very minute. You're already there. You're already in the dark. Verse 10, the one who hates his brother, or the one who loves his brother abides in the light, and there's no cause of stumbling in him. And so one hates his brother, abides in the dark. The other loves his brother, and he abides in the light. And so here is the continual thing. Here's the way he lives. He abides. He lives there in light. When we get over to chapter 5, and John's coming around to this point for about the 6th time, because he hits each one about 7 times in the book. When we get over to chapter 5, John will go this far to say, by this we know that we love the children of God. When we love God, we observe his commandments. There's one of the big points. For this is the love of God. By this we know we love the children of God, when we love God and observe his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. His commandments are not burdensome. So there it is, love and obedience, love of brother, and keeping commandments of God wrapped together, put fully together. This is how we live. This is where we abide. This is where we stay. And if you're walking around in the light, he says in verse 10, there is no cause of stumbling in him. Now, I'm clumsy. I can follow stuff sometimes even when it is light, even when the light's on, even when the sun's up. But I guarantee we all fall a lot more often when the lights are out, when the sun's gone down, when we can't see where we're going. When we love our brother, we live in the light where we can see where we're going. John says there's no cause of stumbling in him. And think about this. Paul, in the book of Romans, talking about the commandments, Romans 13:8, he says, owe no man anyone except to love one another. And so this is your obligation. Your moral ought, you should do this, is to love, Romans 13:8. Owe no one anything except to love. So we owe love. We owe love to folks. For the one who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. So here John says when you love your brother, you abide in the light. And Paul would say when you love your neighbor, you fulfill the law. And then he says all these commandments that loving your neighbor fulfills. Romans 13:9. For this, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. If there's any other commandment, it's summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So that list of things is basically what we call the second table of the law, or the second half of the 10 Commandments. And you think about, if you love your neighbor, here's all the commandments that Paul lists you won't break. You won't commit adultery. Well, people say, well, who does adultery harm? Well, it harms your spouse. It harms the person you're doing it with. It harms your children, harms their children. The breakdown of marriage affects the entirety of the community. Just look at the schools and look at the news. The breakdown of the family is the cause of the problem. Why is the family breaking down? Well, adultery is a big part of it. Not all of it, but a big part of it. If you love your neighbor, your close neighbor in your house, this person you claim to love, that you do the physical act with, you claim some affection for them. If you really cared for them, you wouldn't put this on them, and the effects it'll have on their family and relationships, and the effects that literally go to the entirety of the community, right? Think about the thoughtless behavior of adultery and how much it's harmed sometimes in churches. Churches are torn apart because some fellow or some lady couldn't keep their pants zipped up. What if you loved your neighbor? What if you loved your church? What if you loved your street, your neighborhood? You don't do this. That's the first commandment. He said, you don't murder, right? We'll get to chapter 3, where the one who hates his brother is a murderer. And so even hatred, tends to murder and is equivalent to murder, tantamount to murder. But if you love your neighbor, if you seek their good, well, you won't kill them. You won't beat them either. Well, you're not going to steal from them. You're not going to covet. Those 2 more commandments. You're not going to take their stuff. You're not going to take their life. You're not going to harm their relationships. Why? Because you have regard for others. Verse 10 of Romans 13 says, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Love is therefore the fulfillment of the law. So love sums up the law. Love fulfills the law. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Love does right to a neighbor. That's the light of Christ. So, 1 Peter 4:8, above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. So, here you are, folks. You say you're enlightened. Let's see some enlightenment. Let's see some brotherly love. That's your enlightenment. Someone says, no, I would rather enlightenment be an essay test on my knowledge of esoteric things, or obscure points of theology, or on Trivial Pursuit, a collection of Trivial Pursuit facts on topics that are vaguely spiritual. I'd rather that be the test of enlightenment, because I think I know more than you. Oh, no, that's not it. That is not it. It is love your brother. The one who hates his brother, verse 11, as we move on. The one who hates his brother is in the darkness. Well, if love's in the light, where's hatred? Hatred's in the dark. It's also why people cover it up, right? It's not very often somebody really loves somebody and wants to cover it up. I realize there's some vagaries of romantic love and embarrassment and unrequited love, and that kind of thing. But that's not the love here we're talking about. We're talking about an active goodwill. We're talking about a benevolence, a generous attitude. How often do people hide a good attitude toward another person? It's not often. Why? Well, because it's good. We're proud to have that. We're glad to see it in other people. It's really messed up when people have to hide kind, benevolent attitudes toward other people. There's some situations in this world that are so twisted that's actually true. But it's a really messed up one. But contrary to that, how often is hatred hidden? Often. Hatred's regularly hidden. Hatred abides in the dark. Hatred thrives in the dark. The one who hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in darkness. It's a dark walk to have hate in your heart. And so he doesn't know where he's going. because the darkness has blinded his eye. Again, John 3:19, this is judgment, that the light came into the world and men loved the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. And everyone who does evil hates the light and doesn't come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be manifest as having been wrought or worked in God. And so love and truth and the good things are in the light. They can live in the light. They thrive in the light. But evil and hatred, murder, it thrives in the dark. What's the amount of crime done at night instead of daylight? That's one of our descriptions of things that are just especially wrong, right? We'll talk about a daylight robbery. Like, how especially bold, how especially evil, because there's a right time for that, as it were. There's a common time for that. It's in the dark. It thrives in the dark. Or I think about when we used to live down in the Houston area, lived in that swamp, literally it was a swamp. Our local high school football stadium, just as the same as University of Florida does, we called our stadium the Swamp. It was an aptly named thing. But when we lived in that swamp, you would turn on your light in the house and you'd see bugs scurry. Like, oh man, I don't want to see that, because I'm reminded that all that stuff is here, and it's living here. It's living here amongst us. But why did all the nasty stuff scare you when the light was turned on? Well, morally, it's the same. The nasty stuff scurries when the light's turned on. And when you got nasty stuff bold enough to stand in the light, then you got real problems. But these guys are in darkness and they know it. They're blinded. The darkness has blinded their eyes. Go back to Isaiah 6. Jesus quotes it in John 12, that they've turned from God. They've closed their eyes. They've closed their ears. So they are blind and deaf. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 3, even if our gospel's veiled. So there's people who don't get the gospel. We try to make a plain presentation, a clear presentation of the gospel, crafted in a way that you can and should accept it. This is what the apostles are doing, persuading men. But the gospel they preached, some never saw it. Even if our gospel's veiled, it's veiled to those who are perishing. Well, yeah, they won't open their eyes to it, so that they're going to go to perdition because they won't come to salvation. But why won't they open their eyes to it? In the case, 2 Corinthians 4:4, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving. It's veiled, and the God of this world has blinded their minds in unbelief, that they may not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. The God of this world has blinded them. There's multiple actors here. The scriptures talk about people shutting their own eyes. The scriptures talk about Satan blinding them. The scriptures also talk about God blinding them. In all cases, here are people who don't want the light. They prefer the dark, they shut their eyes. Satan has helped them to shut their eyes and corrupted them to think that's a preferable and better way. And God at some point gives them over to that blindness. He gives them a judicial blindness, a judicial hardening as a consequence of their unbelief, so that they'll stay there and they'll get what they deserve. And so, stay in the light, come to the light, come to the light. Jesus said this in Matthew 15, talking about those who were blind and those who are rebellious. Jesus said, every plant which my Father has not planted shall be rooted up. So let them alone. They're blind guides of the blind. If the blind man guides the blind man, they'll both fall into the pit. The pit is where the blind go. They walk, they abide in darkness. What's the obvious and evident token that this is their path? They hate their brother. In other passages here in this 1 John, we'll find out they don't keep the commandments of God. We'll also find out they don't confess the truth of Jesus as God in the flesh. And so all of these things are blindness that lead them to the same place. It's amazing how each one of these departures, the bad theology leads to bad conduct. The bad conduct seems to lead to bad theology. It's all wrapped up of a piece. And rather than this upward spiral of truth and encouragement and building, if you follow that dark path, it's a downward spiral. It's an ever tightening and oppressive circle, like the person caught in the whirlpool who gets sucked under, and the closer they get to the center of it, the darker and faster it twirls, and the deeper it pulls them down. So there's an upward spiral of light and good based on the truth in Christ, doing what God says, and loving your brother. And there's a downward spiral that's exactly the opposite in every way, in both conduct and in destination. So that's our paragraph for tonight. 1 John 2, verses 7 through 11. Lord willing, in 2 weeks, because next week is the 4th of July. Lord willing, 2 weeks, we'll take it back up again.